Breaking news. Iran and Israel, two sworn enemies, suddenly agree to a ceasefire. But is it really over? Or is this just the calm before an even more explosive storm? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking truth behind this unexpected turn of events. The tension in the Middle East reached a boiling point on June 23, 2025, when a series of missile strikes from Iran rattled Israel's core. What began as a simple military strike quickly escalated into a full-blown crisis that sent shockwaves around the world. But what truly made this moment so chilling was not just the explosions echoing through the night, but the shocking revelation that mere hours after the assault, a ceasefire agreement was on the table. A ceasefire brokered by none other than President Donald Trump. The world held its breath as the possibility of peace seemed fleeting and fragile, hanging in the balance like a thread about to snap. For 12 long days, the skies over Israel had been filled with terror, and the ground beneath Iran's feet trembled with the force of Israel's retaliations. Each missile launched, each bomb dropped, was a grim reminder of the ever-present threat of war. The region had already been marked by years of political tension and military skirmishes, but this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something catastrophic, a war that could engulf not just Israel and Iran, but the entire world. With both sides gearing up for what seemed like an inevitable escalation, no one could predict how far things would go. Yet, just when the world was bracing for a devastating all-out war, a sudden turn of events stunned everyone. The news came at breakneck speed. A ceasefire had been agreed upon. But this wasn't just any peace agreement. It was a deal brokered by one of the most unpredictable leaders in global politics, a man whose very name had been synonymous with controversy, chaos, and unpredictable moves: Donald Trump. His tweet that morning shocked the world. Trump declared that Israel and Iran had both agreed to cease hostilities, that the war, which had seen missile after missile raining down on Israeli soil, would officially end. It was an announcement that felt as surreal as it did hopeful. A ceasefire between two bitter enemies, one that had seemed impossible just hours before. What followed was a flurry of conflicting reports. Israel, while agreeing to the ceasefire, started to signal a de-escalation. The Israeli Air Authority opened the skies once again, allowing flights to resume after temporarily closing their airspace due to the threat of missile attacks. This was seen as a sign, albeit a fragile one, that the worst might finally be over. The streets of Tel Aviv, which had once been emptied, saw life returning. The markets reopened, and people cautiously started to believe that perhaps the nightmare was over. But over in Tehran, the story was not so clear-cut. Iranian officials, while officially announcing the end of their military operations, rejected Trump's version of events. For them, the ceasefire wasn't a moment of peace, but rather a strategic maneuver. Iranian leaders, particularly Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, were quick to downplay Trump's announcement, calling it nothing more than a diplomatic bluff. There is no official ceasefire agreement, Araghchi proclaimed, though he softened his stance by stating that Iran would cease fire if Israel honored the agreement. Yet, despite the calls for peace, tensions ran high. Was Iran truly ready to walk away from this devastating conflict? Or was this just another game of power, one more round in a decades-long struggle for dominance in the region? The entire situation was marred by mistrust. Even as Israel prepared to hold up its end of the ceasefire agreement, Iran's leaders were not so sure. The region, long known for its political volatility, had reached an uneasy crossroads. Everyone knew that while a ceasefire may have been declared, the threat of further escalation was still very real. There were too many factors at play, too many rivalries that ran deep, and too many alliances and enemies to be dealt with. And then there was Trump. As President of the United States, his role in negotiating this ceasefire was monumental, yet controversial. Some saw him as a peacemaker, a hero who had managed to bring two enemies to the table. Others saw him as a manipulator, using the power of his office to play a high-stakes game, one where the lives of millions hung in the balance. Regardless of the perspective, one thing was clear: the world was watching, and the fate of the Middle East could change with the flip of a coin. But what about the future? Even if this ceasefire held, would it truly bring peace to the region? Or was it just a temporary reprieve? Could this moment of fragile calm be the calm before an even fiercer storm? And what of the nuclear ambitions of Iran, the specter that looms large over every diplomatic conversation? Could Trump's gamble on peace be enough to stabilize the region? Or would it spark a fire that would ignite a conflict no one could control? As the world waited, the question remained, was this ceasefire the beginning of a new era of peace, or simply another chapter in the long, violent history of the Middle East? As the hours passed following President Trump's groundbreaking announcement, the world found itself suspended in a strange, surreal limbo. A ceasefire had been declared, but it wasn't just the announcement itself that captured global attention. It was the sharp, contrasting reactions from all parties involved. The story was far from simple, and beneath the surface, there were far more questions than answers. From the Israeli side, a tentative sense of relief began to settle. While the missiles had stopped, the streets, once empty from the constant threat of attack, slowly began to see signs of life again. The Israeli Air Authority reopened its airspace, signaling that the immediate threat had eased. It was a clear sign that Israel was taking the step toward compliance with the ceasefire. But even as the planes took off, the skies remained charged with a silent tension. The people of Israel, especially those who had been forced to hide in shelters only days before, couldn't help but wonder, was this truly the end of their nightmare? Could they afford to believe in the possibility of peace? Or was this just the calm before another, far more intense storm? On the ground in Israel, military leaders and politicians were carefully considering the terms of the ceasefire. There was no celebration, only cautious optimism. And for some, it was difficult to trust the sudden shift in the air. No one could forget the pain and destruction of the past 12 days. Yes, the missiles had stopped falling, but that didn't mean that the threat had completely vanished. There were still too many questions, too many unresolved issues for Israel to completely let down its guard. Would Iran honor its commitment to ceasefire? Would they continue to pursue nuclear ambitions? Could trust truly be restored after years of hostility? In Tehran, the story was even more complex. Iranian officials, while publicly declaring the end of military operations, seemed far less convinced that the ceasefire would lead to any meaningful resolution. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi's comments revealed the deep-rooted mistrust between the two nations. Despite agreeing to halt military actions, Araghchi rejected Trump's public assertion of a formal agreement, calling the ceasefire nothing more than a diplomatic ploy. The Iranian government seemed to regard the announcement with suspicion, questioning the sincerity of the U.S. and Israeli commitments. They were wary that Israel might not fully abide by the ceasefire, and that this could be just another chapter in a long history of broken promises. The Iranian leadership had been through too much. Decades of conflict, sanctions, and international pressure had taught them to tread carefully. While the announcement from Trump was a diplomatic victory on the surface, it was seen by some in Iran as a strategic maneuver, a way to push Iran into a corner and test its resolve. The ceasefire might have seemed like a step toward peace, but for many in Tehran, it felt like a temporary truce, one that could unravel at any moment. The concern about Israel's nuclear arsenal, the continued global scrutiny over Iran's own nuclear program, and the pressure from the West left Iran in a precarious position. For them, the real victory wasn't in halting military action. It was in ensuring that their future in the region was not dictated by external powers. In their minds, peace was only possible if their interests, too, were respected. On the global stage, Trump's role as the broker of peace seemed almost too good to be true. His announcement that both countries had agreed to cease hostilities painted him as the ultimate peacemaker. But behind the scenes, there were whispers of doubts. Was Trump's involvement a genuine step toward lasting peace, or was it simply a tactical move to secure political gain? After all, Trump had built his career on unpredictability, and some feared that his push for a ceasefire might have been more about gaining leverage than about ensuring peace. His history of bold statements and actions made many question his true motivations. Was this truly a shift toward a new era in the Middle East, or was it another calculated move in a much larger geopolitical game? Yet, despite the suspicion surrounding Trump's role, there was no denying that his leadership had been pivotal. Through a series of diplomatic channels, the U.S. had managed to bring both Iran and Israel to the negotiating table. But even as both sides agreed to halt military operations, the real work of maintaining peace was only just beginning. The fragile agreement was bound to face immense challenges, especially when dealing with countries with such deeply entrenched hostilities. The question remained, could both nations maintain their commitment to peace, or would the fragile truce collapse under the weight of old grudges? For now, the world watched with bated breath. The ceasefire was in place, but the future remained uncertain. Both Iran and Israel had their own reasons for agreeing to stop fighting, but they also had their own agendas and concerns. What would happen when the dust settled? Would the tensions that had built up over decades simply dissipate, or would they resurface, even more intense than before? As the days passed, the world continued to hold its breath. The ceasefire had been agreed upon, but peace was not guaranteed. In the end, only time would tell whether this fragile moment of calm would give way to lasting tranquility, or whether it would ultimately be another chapter in the turbulent history of the Middle East. The world could only wait, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. The ceasefire between Israel and Iran, though fragile, had been achieved. But even as the dust began to settle, the complex, tangled web of tensions that had led to this point remained very much intact. While the immediate military threat subsided, the question loomed large. Could this ceasefire mark the beginning of lasting peace, or was it simply a temporary pause in a long-standing, deeply rooted conflict? For both Israel and Iran, the ceasefire was not a resolution, it was a reprieve. Israel, while initially welcoming the ceasefire, knew all too well that peace in the region was a delicate, elusive concept. They had been through these cycles before, periods of calm followed by sudden escalations, broken agreements, and renewed violence. The threat from Iran, especially regarding its nuclear ambitions, was far from neutralized. As Israel cautiously de-escalated its military presence, allowing flights to resume and signaling a return to normalcy, there was no celebratory air, just a shared, somber understanding that this could all unravel at any moment. Even as the missiles stopped falling, Israel knew that the ceasefire could, in the blink of an eye, disintegrate. The questions that hung in the air were not just about whether Iran would hold up its end of the deal, but whether Israel, given its history of distrust toward its neighbors, could ever genuinely trust Iran's word. For Israel, this moment was one of calculated risk. They had agreed to the ceasefire, but the reality of the situation weighed heavily on them. They had seen enough betrayals and broken promises from their adversaries to understand that trust was a commodity in short supply. Their military leaders and policymakers knew that, even if this ceasefire held, the fundamental issues, the existential threats posed by Iran's nuclear program and its destabilizing influence across the region, remained unresolved. This ceasefire, however significant, was just another chapter in a long saga of fragile truces, each one built on the hope that a lasting peace might one day be possible. But as the past had proven time and again, that hope was a fragile thing, often shattered by the harsh realities of geopolitics. For Iran, the ceasefire was far from a concession of goodwill. Iranian leaders, especially Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, were swift to cast doubt on Trump's announcement. While they publicly agreed to the cessation of military operations, the skepticism was palpable. Araghchi's remarks emphasized Iran's stance that this agreement was not a genuine peace accord, but rather a temporary pause dictated by strategic necessity. For Iran, this ceasefire was a means to an end, a way to buy time, to regroup, and to navigate through the pressure from international powers. Iran had never been comfortable with the West's influence, and any ceasefire brokered by the United States, regardless of how it was framed, was viewed with suspicion. The Iranian leadership had long felt under siege, first by international sanctions, and then by the continuous threat of military action from Israel and the United States. It was a cynical calculus. Ceasefire now, rearm later. The real question for Iran was not whether they would keep their word in the short term, but whether they could navigate the larger geopolitical forces at play. Would they be forced to give in to American pressure, Or could they use this moment to reassert their power? The stakes were, and remain, immense. The nuclear question was the elephant in the room, looming over every diplomatic exchange, every military action, and every ceasefire. Israel's security concerns had always been tied to the fear of Iran's nuclear capabilities. For Israel, this was not just about territorial disputes or political rivalries. It was about survival. The specter of a nuclear-armed Iran was a nightmare that could reshape the entire balance of power in the Middle East. For Iran, however, their nuclear program was a matter of national pride and a symbol of their sovereignty in the face of international pressure. Both sides were locked in a high-stakes game where any misstep could lead to catastrophic consequences. This ceasefire, while it may have stopped the fighting for now, did little to address the deep underlying issues that continued to fester between these two nations. The broader international community, meanwhile, was left to wonder whether this ceasefire would pave the way for meaningful negotiations, or whether it would simply delay the inevitable. The U.S. under President Trump had played a key role in brokering the deal, but America's long-standing role as an intermediary in Middle Eastern conflicts had been fraught with complexities. Trump's involvement in this deal, while lauded by some, had its share of critics. Some saw this as yet another attempt by the U.S. to assert its influence over a volatile region, while others questioned whether Trump's motivations were truly rooted in a desire for peace or if he was seeking political gain on the global stage. Regardless of the underlying motivations, however, Trump's role had undeniably been pivotal in bringing both Israel and Iran to the table. But now the real test would be whether the peace could hold once the global spotlight faded. Could Iran and Israel, two nations with deep historical mistrust, truly find common ground? Or would this ceasefire, like so many before it, serve only as a temporary distraction before the next round of hostilities? As the world watched, it was clear that this was not the end of the story. The ceasefire might have stopped the immediate bloodshed, but it did nothing to resolve the deeper existential conflicts that plagued the Middle East. The future of this fragile peace depended not just on the willingness of Israel and Iran to uphold their agreements, but on the ability of the international community to navigate the delicate power dynamics in play. As the days turned into weeks, the question remained: would this ceasefire be the spark that ignited a new era of peace, or would it be yet another false dawn, leading to another round of conflict? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: the eyes of the world were fixed squarely on this moment of fragile calm, and the stakes had never been higher.